The afternoon he returned my passport to a locked drawer in his study for safekeeping, he told me it was because I was always losing important things. I had never once lost a passport in my life. My name is Solveig. His name was Anders. And by the time this story ends, you will understand why I spent 19 months memorizing the exact sound his car made when it turned into our driveway. I want to be honest from the start because I think stories like mine get told too often as sudden reversals, a single dramatic moment that changes everything. That is not how it happened. What happened to me happened in inches, over years, the way water wears down stone without either of them noticing the exact day the shape began to change. Anders and I married 8 years before the passport, together for 11. In the early years, he managed things with what looked, from the outside, like admirable competence. He handled our travel documents because he was better organized. He kept our joint accounts because numbers came easily to him and made me anxious. He began, gradually, reviewing which of my friendships he considered worth the emotional investment, always framing it as concern for how I spent my limited time and energy, never as control, though control is exactly what it was. By the time he locked my passport away, I had already lived for years inside a version of my own life that required his approval to leave the house for more than a grocery run, though he never once phrased any single restriction as a rule. Each one arrived dressed as care. That is the particular cruelty of men like Anders. They never ask you to hand over your freedom all at once. They simply make it inconvenient enough, piece by piece, that eventually you stop reaching for it yourself. The passport was the final piece. I had mentioned, casually, that I wanted to visit my cousin in Norway for a family reunion that summer, alone, for the first time in over a decade. Anders listened, nodded in the way that meant he had already decided against it before I finished speaking, and told me travel alone wasn't a good idea right now, citing vague concerns about my health, my stress levels, my tendency, as he put it, to overcommit and then fall apart. I had never fallen apart from a plane ticket in my life. I said nothing that evening. I simply nodded, the way I had learned to nod, and went to bed early. But that night, lying awake beside a man who had just quietly ended my only chance at an unsupervised week in over a decade, I made the decision that would occupy the next 19 months of my life. I decided I would not ask Anders for permission to leave again. I decided that whatever life I rebuilt, I would build it so completely outside his awareness that by the time he understood what was happening, there would be nothing left for him to lock away. The attic became my quiet headquarters, specifically a narrow crawl space behind the water heater that Anders, a man deeply uninterested in anything resembling manual labor, had never once entered in 11 years of marriage. There, inside an old suitcase that had belonged to my grandmother, I began building a second life in careful, deliberate pieces. The first piece was money. I had, for years, managed the household grocery budget, and I began, slowly, reporting slightly inflated costs, banking the small difference in cash inside an envelope taped to the underside of the suitcase's lining. It was slow. Some weeks it amounted to no more than $15 or $20. But I had learned by then that patience compounds in ways anger never does, and over a year and a half, that patience became just over $9,000, enough, I understood, to survive somewhere on my own for a few crucial months while everything else came together. The second piece was information. I began, whenever Anders left his study unlocked, which was rare but not unheard of, especially during the hour each morning he spent in the shower, quietly documenting what I found using a prepaid phone purchased with cash from a shop 2 counties away, kept charged in short bursts, and hidden inside the lining of my grandmother's suitcase alongside the envelope of cash. Anders worked as a senior underwriter at a private wealth management firm called Halvorsen Kessler Advisory, a boutique operation that managed investment portfolios for a small, exclusive roster of wealthy clients, many of them elderly, several of them widows who had inherited significant estates and trusted the firm's reputation for discretion and careful, conservative management. Anders had worked there for 14 years and held a position of considerable independent authority, one of only 3 senior advisors permitted to make certain trades and transfers without a second signature. His supervisor, and the person he ultimately answered to, was the firm's managing partner, a man named Casper Lindqvist, 61 years old. A man who had built the firm's entire reputation over 3 decades on the specific promise that Halvorsen Kessler treated its clients' money with the same care of family treats and inheritance, never gambling, never overreaching, always transparent. I had met Casper several times over the years at firm dinners, a soft-spoken man who once told me, with obvious pride, that Anders was the most conservative advisor on my team, the one I'd trust with my own mother's money without hesitation. I remember smiling politely and believing him completely because at the time I had no reason not to. That changed 9 months into my quiet preparation. On a Sunday afternoon when Anders left his study door unlocked longer than usual, absorbed in a phone call in another room. A folder on his desktop, left open on the screen, caught my attention only because of its curious name, Client Rebalancing Legacy. Underwriters, I understood even with my limited knowledge, did not typically maintain personal folders labeled that way for client accounts that belonged, in every legal sense, to the firm itself. Inside were spreadsheets tracking a handful of elderly clients' accounts, several of them widows I recognized by name from firm holiday parties, showing periodic small transfers out of their conservative, low-risk holdings into an account structure I did not recognize, always recorded internally as rebalancing for tax efficiency. Always timed in amounts small enough that no single transfer would trigger the kind of flag that might draw a compliance officer's attention, but consistent enough, across years, that the cumulative effect was significant. Attached emails between Anders and a man named Torvald Nyman, who ran something described only as an independent advisory consultancy, made clear that a portion of each transfer was eventually returned to an account bearing Anders's own name, structured to look, on paper, like a legitimate consulting fee. I did not touch the study further that day. I closed the folder exactly as I had found it and left the room before Anders finished his call, and I sat afterward in our kitchen for a long time, doing the peculiar math of understanding, all at once, that the man who controlled every detail of my own freedom had also spent years quietly draining the security of women who trusted him with the last money they would ever have. Over the following 2 months, I documented what I could, in careful, widely spaced sessions using the prepaid phone, photographing screens during the narrow windows Anders occasionally left himself logged in, never staying longer than necessary, always returning everything exactly as I had found it. I sent nothing forward yet. I understood, even then, that what I had stumbled onto was larger than my own marriage, and that acting too quickly, without full understanding, could destroy the evidence before it could ever help the women it was meant to protect. During this period, Anders's oversight of my own life did not relax. If anything, it sharpened. An instinct I have since come to recognize in men like him, some subconscious sense that something had shifted even before any specific evidence surfaced. He began, again, reviewing my phone each evening, a habit he had mostly abandoned years earlier, scrolling through messages with the particular concentration of a man convinced he was about to find something. My real phone remained, deliberately, an uneventful record of nothing at all, while the prepaid phone stayed hidden in my grandmother's suitcase, charged only in careful bursts, never once discovered. The night I understood the true scope of what Anders had built, I was not in his study at all. I was in our own basement storage room, sorting old files at his request ahead of a planned renovation, files from years before Halvorsen Kessler, back when Anders had briefly worked at a smaller advisory firm that had quietly closed under circumstances he had always described vaguely as market conditions. Inside one box, beneath old performance reviews, was a folder of early correspondence between Anders and Torvald Nyman, dated years before Anders ever joined Halvorsen Kessler at all. The arrangement, I understood with a slow, sickening clarity, was not new. Anders had built this exact structure once before, at a firm that had collapsed partly, I now suspected, because of it, and had simply carried the same quiet mechanism, refined and more careful, into an institution that trusted him completely. I called my cousin Freya in Norway that night, the very relative whose reunion I had never been permitted to attend, using the prepaid phone from inside the locked bathroom, running the shower to cover the sound of my voice. I had not spoken to her in months, not because I did not want to, but because Anders had made even that difficult in small, deniable ways. When I explained what I had found, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the words that finally moved me from careful observation into deliberate action. She said, "Solveig, this is not just about you leaving him anymore. These are women who trusted him with everything they had left. You need someone who understands exactly what you're looking at." Freya connected me, through a friend of a friend, to a forensic financial investigator named Ingrid Halvard, who specialized in uncovering exactly this kind of quiet, long-running advisory fraud. I called Ingrid from a payphone outside a pharmacy, paying with coins I had saved specifically for this purpose. She listened to my description of the rebalancing transfers and the shadow consulting fees for nearly 40 minutes without interrupting, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful gravity of someone who understood immediately how serious it was. She told me two things I have carried with me ever since. The first was that what I was describing sounded like a sustained pattern of investment advisor fraud, specifically targeting vulnerable elderly clients, the exact kind of case that draws attention not only from a firm's internal compliance department, but potentially from state securities regulators and elder financial abuse investigators. The second thing she said more quietly. She said, "Solveig, once this moves forward, it will not stop at your marriage. It could end his career and his freedom both. I need you to understand that before we take another step." I told her I had understood that for months, and that understanding it was precisely why it had taken me so long to be ready. Over the following 10 weeks, working carefully through the prepaid phone and narrow windows of opportunity, I sent Ingrid everything I had gathered: the photographed rebalancing spreadsheets, the correspondence with Torvald Nyman, the older files establishing the scheme's origin at Anders's previous firm. Ingrid compiled a preliminary investigative summary, methodical and precise, designed to withstand scrutiny from people who had every professional incentive to hope it was not true. While Ingrid worked, I made two further preparations. The first was a consultation with a family attorney named Margit Solberg, recommended through Freya's network, who specialized in cases involving financial coercive control and isolation, a pattern she described to me with an accuracy that made the last decade of my life suddenly uncomfortably legible. Margit began quietly preparing an emergency filing that would restore my access to my own passport and financial independence, built on documented years of restricted movement and controlled finances. The second preparation was smaller, more private. I began, item by careful item, moving what remained of my own independent belongings, my grandmother's letters, a small collection of her jewelry, a set of paintings from my own mother that Anders had always found, too sentimental for the walls, into a storage unit rented under a slight variation of my maiden name, paid for entirely from the envelope of grocery money hidden in the suitcase lining. I was not fleeing. I understood, by then, precisely the distinction. I was simply arriving, slowly, at a life that no longer required his signature to exist. The final piece arrived on an ordinary Wednesday, when Anders mentioned over dinner, with quiet pride, that Casper had just expanded his client roster to include several additional legacy accounts inherited from a retiring colleague, most of them, he noted almost carelessly, elderly widows with substantial, conservatively managed estates. He said it the way men like him say things they assume no one else at the table is equipped to understand the full implications of. I refilled his water glass and said nothing, because I understood immediately what that expansion actually meant. More vulnerable women, more quiet transfers, more of the same theft continuing to widen while everyone around him continued to trust his careful reputation completely. That same week, Ingrid finished her preliminary report. Margit filed the emergency personal protective and financial independence request the following morning, submitting Ingrid's findings simultaneously to the State Securities Division and to Halvorsen Kessler's outside compliance counsel, ensuring the information could not simply be quietly absorbed by anyone inside the firm still loyal to Anders. I made one final call myself, to Casper Lindqvist's office directly, using my full name for the first time in months, requesting an urgent private meeting regarding what I described only as a serious matter involving client trust. His assistant, a woman named Runa, asked for more detail. I said it was personal, and it could not wait, and something in my voice must have carried real weight, because she found me an opening the very next morning. I dressed with unusual care, A navy suit purchased with money from the suitcase lining, hair pulled back, wearing, for the first time in years, a small ring that had belonged to my grandmother, the one piece I had refused to store away with everything else. I did not attempt to disguise the particular exhaustion in my own face, the tiredness of a woman who has spent 19 months being vigilant every single day, because I understood, by then, that this too was its own kind of evidence, even if no formal document would ever record it as such. Halvorsen Kessler's offices occupied the top 2 floors of an elegant, understated building downtown, all soft lighting and quiet carpets, the visual language of a firm that had built its entire identity around discretion. Casper's office was lined with photographs of clients at charity galas, decades of relationships built on trust one now understood had been, at least partially, betrayed from within for years. He stood when I entered, shook my hand warmly, and gestured to a chair, his expression carrying the polite curiosity of a man who had no idea his morning was about to end very differently than it began. I placed a sealed folder on his desk and slid it toward him, without preamble. Inside was the summary Ingrid and Margit had prepared together, the rebalancing transfers alongside the shadow consulting payments, the correspondence establishing the scheme's origin years before Anders's employment at Halvorsen Kessler, and a cover letter noting that copies had already been submitted to state regulators and outside compliance counsel that same morning. Casper opened the folder slowly. He read the first page, then the second, and I watched his expression move through the same sequence I have come to recognize by now in every person confronted, all at once, with the discovery that someone they trusted completely has been quietly betraying the very foundation they built their reputation upon. Confusion first, then a dawning, sickened comprehension, as he began to understand which specific clients, which specific widows, had been affected, several of whom, I would later learn, he considered personal friends. He looked up at me once, about halfway through, his hand pressed flat against the desk as though physically steadying himself against what he was reading. I did not look away. I simply let him keep reading. When he finished, he closed the folder carefully, both hands flat against it, the stillness of a man absorbing a betrayal that would follow his firm's reputation for years, regardless of how correctly he handled what came next. He asked, quietly, how long I had known. I told him the truth, that I had understood the full scope only in recent months, though the scheme itself, I suspected, predated even his relationship with Anders. He thanked me, his voice steadier than I expected, and told me the firm would cooperate fully with any investigation, whatever the cost to its own reputation. I stood, thanked him for his time, and told him the regulatory filing had already gone out that morning, timed deliberately so no one inside the firm would have the opportunity to quietly manage the problem before outside investigators could examine it independently. Casper nodded once, slowly, already reaching for his phone as I left the room. Outside the building, I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes before walking to my car, not to collect myself because that work had been done slowly over 19 months and there was nothing left to gather in that moment, but because I wanted to remember precisely how it felt. The folder leaving my hands, the particular quality of silence in a room where a man who had spent 30 years building a reputation for careful trust understood, all at once, exactly how deeply that trust had been exploited. Anders called at 1:30. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more within the hour, each time closer together, the rhythm of a man beginning to sense, without yet understanding the specifics, that something fundamental had shifted beneath him without his permission. At 3:00, he sent a single text. It said only, "What have you done?" Not quite a question. He already knew, in the particular way guilty men always already know, even before they understand precisely what has caught up to them. I did not respond. I drove instead to the storage unit, sat for a while beside the boxes holding what remained of my life before Anders, my grandmother's letters still tied with faded ribbon, my mother's paintings wrapped carefully in cloth, and allowed myself, for the first time in 19 months, to simply breathe without calculating a single next move. Then I drove home, because Margit had advised maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy until the filing was formally processed, and because I wanted one final ordinary evening in that house as a woman who understood exactly what was coming, while Anders still did not. He came home late that night, unusually quiet, and did not mention the folder or the calls or the text. He asked, instead, whether I wanted to order dinner, his voice carrying the careful, softened tone he used whenever some instinct told him his control over a situation was slipping and needed to be gently recaptured rather than forced. I told him I had already eaten. I went to bed early. He sat alone downstairs for a long time before he finally came up. The independence filing was formally granted 4 days later, restoring my access to my own passport and establishing separate financial accounts entirely outside Anders's control. Halvorsen Kessler placed him on administrative leave within the week, once their own internal compliance review confirmed the pattern Ingrid had already independently documented. He was terminated a month later, once the scale of the fraud, ultimately estimated at just over $800,000 once investigators traced the full history back through his previous firm, became impossible for Halvorsen Kessler to characterize as an isolated lapse in judgment. I did not attend the criminal proceedings that eventually followed, though Freya flew in for 2 of the hearings and reported back to me afterward in a voice that had shifted, over the months, from disbelief to something quieter and more settled. Anders accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial, agreeing to restitution obligations that would follow him for the rest of his working life and a sentence that included both probation and a period of incarceration, though by then I had stopped measuring justice by the length of anyone's sentence and started measuring it, instead, by the simple fact that several elderly women I had once smiled politely at during firm dinners would finally see some portion of what had quietly been taken from them. Anders's mother, a woman named Kirsten who had never once, in 11 years, asked me a single question about my own life beyond how well I was managing her son's moods, called me once, weeks after he moved out. She asked whether I had known, before it became public, what he had actually been doing. I told her the truth, that I had known enough, eventually, to understand it needed to stop, and that I regretted it had taken this particular shape to get there. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice stripped of the careful distance she had always maintained with me, she said she was sorry, for years spent assuming that whatever seemed difficult about our marriage was mine to smooth over rather than his to answer for. We have not spoken since, but I think of that call sometimes, the strange, late arrival of an apology that changes nothing and still, somehow, matters. I moved eventually into a small apartment overlooking the water, close enough to visit my cousin's family whenever I chose, far enough from the house Anders and I had shared that I stopped, within a few months, listening for the particular sound of his car turning into a driveway that no longer existed for either of us. Freya helped me unpack the last of my boxes on a bright afternoon in early spring, and when we finished, we sat on the floor of my new living room, my grandmother's suitcase open between us, empty now except for a single, worn passport, freshly stamped from a trip I had finally taken entirely on my own. I think often about the woman I was the afternoon Anders locked my passport away and told me, gently, that it was for my own good. I think about how long it took me to understand that the softness of his explanations had never once meant safety. I did not destroy Anders. I want to be precise about that, the way precision has come to matter to me since. Anders destroyed the trust of women who had already lost husbands and believed, reasonably, that a firm built on the language of careful stewardship would actually steward what little security they had left. I simply stopped shielding him from the consequences of what he had already done, one photograph, one document, one quiet phone call at a time, in a house he believed he understood completely, in a life he never once thought to look at closely enough to see what I was quietly building behind him. The most dangerous thing a man like Anders can do is assume that a woman who has stopped asking for permission has also stopped moving. I had 19 months of movement running beneath my stillness, and by the time he understood that, the story had already been finished, filed, and delivered, in an office lined with photographs of trusted clients, by a woman he had once quietly decided could not be trusted with her own passport.